Good afternoon, everyone. I am Shelley Broderick, Dean Emerita of the UDC David A. Clark School of Law, your tax dollars at work. We're going to kick today off by introducing our current dean, Twinette Johnson. Let me bring her out now. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Twinette Johnson, as Shelley indicated, and I serve as the interim dean and the professor of law at the University of the District of Columbia, David A. Clark School of Law. So again, welcome to the University of the District of Columbia. Welcome to Cahn Legacy Weekend. We will also celebrate Joyce Camper Kahn's legacy tomorrow night and hold our law review symposium on Saturday. But on today, I want to wholeheartedly welcome you to this long overdue celebration of Edgar Kahn's legacy. As some of you know, UDC Law is the nation's capital's only public school. At our school, we require all of our students to graduate with between 10 and 14 credit hours of clinical instruction. We match our students with attorney professors who, over the course of all those clinic instruction hours, train our students in and expose our students to the rigors of law practice. And for our efforts, the law school is ranked 5th in the nation for its clinical instruction program. But our clinics and our professor-student attorneys serve an even greater purpose. They represent the people of the District of Columbia. They fight on small and large scales the injustices that impact people's ability to live to the height of their potential. In short, they change lives. And I believe that is what Edgar and Jean set out to do when they founded Antioch Law School in 1972. They set out to change lives. And I'm so happy to report that their dream, their work, and their legacy not only lives at UDC Law, it thrives. Before I take my seat, I'd like to share a personal anecdote about Edgar. I started at UDC Law 6 years ago with the main goal of addressing bar pass. Edgar was one of the first professors who came to me personally to ask how he could help. And he never stopped asking how he could help. He never stopped making himself available. I can tell you that he never missed a faculty meeting. Big ones, small ones, he never missed. I can tell you that he had ideas because he would call me on my cell phone to tell me those ideas. I can tell you he had plans for his work and for his students. I can tell you that he thought about students and worked really hard to make sure they had the experience we promised them when we admit them to UDC Law. As a dean, I can tell you that he was the type of faculty member that I appreciate and that I need. I miss Edgar, and that is why I'm so elated to see all of you here and to know that there are so many of you who are watching the stream. I'm so elated that all of you are here to celebrate Edgar's life and his legacy. Welcome again to UDC and to what I know will be a wonderful celebration of a man who lived the motto: to practice law, promote justice, and change lives. Dr. Edgar Cahn. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Twinette. It's now my pleasure to introduce Rabbi David Schneier, founder of A.M. Kollel, a welcoming and diverse Jewish renewal community located in Montgomery County and serving Greater Washington. David married Edgar and Chris in 2000, and thereafter his activism and advocacy made him a friend and ally. David?
So happy to be here representing my community. This past week, the Torah reading, the reading from the Bible in the Jewish world, is it's the book of. We just beginning the book of Leviticus, And the book of Leviticus is about creating conscious community. The people, they just built the sacred center, the Mishkan it's called, but they're not really ready to go on because they have to also work on what it means to be living in a conscious community. And so here we are, celebrating a person's life whose life was devoted creating conscious community and a beloved community. And as one of our teachers, Martin Buber, also called it a community of response. I would like to share with you a verse from Psalms, from the book of Psalms. It's light is sown for the just and joy for the upright in heart. Light is sown for the just and joy for the upright in heart.
Or zarua latzadik oishrei lev simcha or zarua latzadik oishrei lev simcha or zarua latzadik oishrei lev simcha or zarua latzadik oishrei lev simcha.
Thank you, that was lovely. I am awash, as you might imagine, in memories of Edgar Cahn. Today you're going to hear speakers describe the colorful mosaic that was the life and times of Edgar Cahn. And I'm going to walk you through some of the highlights of my journey with him, which lasted, come June 9th, 44 years. I was Edgar's student, his employee, his boss, his colleague, his co-conspirator, his ally, and his acolyte. He was my dear, dear friend, and I loved him very much. I was Edgar and Jean's last hire at Antioch in 1979. They brought me in as a clinical fellow to the only program in the country that offered a master's degree in teaching clinical legal education at Antioch. They immediately put me on the admissions committee, and they told me, Shelley, your job is to bring in 150 of the worst troublemakers you can find who want to make social change. A lot of you are here. And thus began my life's work. The journey, as all journeys with Edgar have been, is a bumpy road. For example, my first day at Antioch, my first law job, thrilled to death, they announced something called a payless payday. I hadn't known that was a thing. I later had furlough days, but anyway. Edgar and Jean, it turned out, were in a pitched battle with Antioch University. Antioch would take in the tuition, not pay our bills. Jean and Edgar sued them, they got fired. Yeah, it was bumpy, very bumpy. Joe Libertelli is going to tell you about Edgar and Jean's pivotal role in the Save Antioch and the establishment of the new public law school. That road was beyond bumpy for 2 years. It was rutted, it was muddy, the bridge was out, the trees were, and desperate times called for desperate measures. The board put me in charge. I was 35, I was a criminal defense lawyer, had no idea what I was doing, but I knew enough to immediately hire Edgar and Jean Cahn. Their mission, in keeping with the Cahn-inspired mission, the statutory mission, to recruit and enroll students from racial, ethnic, and other backgrounds traditionally underrepresented at the bar. In other words, go out and find the worst troublemakers they could find who wanted to make social change, and lots of you are here too. But how do you do that? How do you recruit a class to a school that had no accreditation, no building, and no dean? Edgar said something about a press gang, but I never believed that. Really, what they did was inspire applicants. They would put their arms around people and show them the future, where they would educate people from the neighborhood to represent people in the neighborhood, and to serve the least among us, the people with the least power, the least money, to work with them to change it all up, make it different. They convinced 54 happy warriors to join our merry band. Was it a bumpy road, that recruiting process? We moved into the new building the day after they removed the asbestos from the ceiling tiles in all 6 floors. We were perched in the 6th grade with wires hanging down, in the 6th floor with wires hanging out, no ceiling, no air conditioning. It was July. It was hottest July on record in Washington, D.C. And there we were, 10 o'clock on a Sunday night, Jean, Edgar, and me reviewing applications. And I looked over, and Jean's neck was bleeding. And no, okay, it's not bleeding. She was wearing strawberry wax earrings, and it was so hot, they melted. Yeah, bumpy, a lot of bumps. Edgar and I were awarded tenure the same day. Edgar turned to me and said, "Shelley, tenure, a bulletproof vest." Edgar and I then drafted tenure standards that valued groundbreaking legal work like briefs and amici and so forth just as much as traditional scholarship. The first 3 test cases came up with groundbreaking legal work and not so much classic scholarship. Edgar turned to me and said, "Shelley, we'll either celebrate or organize." Okay, another bump in the road. About 5 years later, DC pretty much went bankrupt. I always tell people, never start a public law school when your city's going bankrupt, because it's going to be so much harder. But still, oh, and by the way, we had furlough days. Those are a different form of payless pay days. 18 one year, 20 the next year. You have to work, because it's a school. Anyway. Edgar at UDC started 2 extraordinary programs. One is Law and Justice and the Community Service Program. So every student who went to Antioch and to this day writes an essay as their application. Does this ring a bell with folks? Talk about an instance of injustice that you experienced or witnessed. What did you do about it, and what would you do now? Edgar broke the students into small groups during orientation, and they all shared their injustices. And they broke down barriers, and they built community. And Edgar would bring in our alums and other social justice warriors and partner them up with students, and off they would go to serve this community throughout their law school career. And just for the cherry on top, Edgar and Chris would invite every single first-year student over for pizza parties at their house in small groups, again, which built community. And the second program was the LLM in systems change. Edgar and Chris co-taught that, and I'll let Chris fill in that part of the mosaic. But together, they trained dozens of new clinical law professors and lawyers to go out and make the world a more fair and a more just place, to address broken systems that disproportionately harm low-income people and Black and brown people. I want to leave you with 2 additional observations. Edgar was always all in. He was kind and caring and thoughtful. He didn't have a mean bone in his body. He was never snarky, unlike some of us. When I got married, he showed up at the door with a doormat that said, "Here lives a lawyer and a normal person." When my husband was sick in hospice and living at home, Edgar and Chris showed up with food on multiple Sundays, and they would sit companionably and watch football games. He was a mensch. Finally, Edgar had an extraordinary capacity to partner, to collaborate in service of transformational goals. First with Jean, 30 years, the Legal Services Corporation and Antioch School of Law. And then with Chris, 23 years, with time banking and systems change. And also was with me. Edgar was my partner in crime for 44 years, establishing the new law school and keeping it true to its values. Edgar passed that torch to me and to our students and to our faculty and to our clients and to all of you. Be yours to hold it high. Thank you, Edgar, and happy birthday. Phew, I'm so glad that's over. Okay. It is now my honor to bring our warrior in Congress, Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm grateful and honored to provide these remarks to honor my dear friend, Dr. Edgar Cahn. I first met Edgar and his wife, Jean, at Yale Law School, where we were all students. I closely followed both Edgar's and Jean's work and was happy when they moved to my district here in the District of Columbia in 1963, when Jean began working at the State Department and Edgar became a special assistant and speechwriter for Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. They both would later work in the Office of Economic Opportunity, where they, along with Sergeant Shriver, established a first-of-its-kind federally funded program to provide legal aid to low-income Americans. This groundbreaking initiative, the predecessor to the Legal Services Corporation, is widely acknowledged as setting a blueprint for legal services and catalyzing what was then the burgeoning field of public interest law. I am proud to support Legal Services Corporation in the Congress today. Edgar next undertook a 2-year campaign organizing Native American leaders in an effort that led to the end of the official federal policy of terminating Native American tribes. Edgar would go on to write a book on this issue, Our Brother's Keeper, the Indian in White America. This led to the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. Edgar and Jean would go on to found the Antioch School of Law, the predecessor of the University of the District of Columbia's David A. Clark School of Law. Edgar served as a member of the UDC faculty, law faculty, until the end of his life. Edgar was a visionary in strategies to alleviate poverty, a pioneer in clinical legal education, and a dear friend. I was proud to recently submit a statement about his life into the congressional record. Edgar led with an unwavering focus to help the most vulnerable among us. He was equally beloved for his kindness, and I know I speak for us all when I say he will be greatly missed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. She's amazing. Trying to keep that rotten Congress out of DC's. Anyway, I want to bring up another warrior in the DC Council who's been so incredibly supportive of the law school, Councilmember Mary Che, Ward 3.
Good afternoon, everybody. I have to amend those remarks. Former council member. I decided to step away. I come today with a ceremonial resolution that the council adopted to recognize the life and accomplishments of Edgar Cahn, which are extraordinary. And it's also the occasion for me to point out that unlike some of the things we do on the council, this was unanimous. And if you'll permit me, I'd like to read some of the whereas clauses with respect to this resolution. Whereas Edgar Stuart Cahn was born on March 23, 1935, and was raised in an activist household. He got the genes, and then he developed the genes with his father, Edmund Cahn, a prominent legal philosopher and professor at NYU, and his mother, Eleanor Khan, a social activist for the sick and elderly. Whereas he received his undergraduate degree in English literature from Swarthmore College in 1956 and achieved a master's and a PhD in the subject at Yale University. And he continued on to earn a law degree at Yale Law School. While at Swarthmore, Edgar met and fell in love with fellow student Joyce Camper, forming a partnership that would eventually spur substantial social, political, and legal change for the benefit of the country's most vulnerable, and they would marry in 1957 in New York. Whereas Edgar and Jean, both Yale Law School alumni, in 1963 moved to the District of Columbia, with Jean working as a legal advisor in the Department of State, later transferring to the Office of Economic Opportunity, and Edgar was a special assistant to and speechwriter for the then Attorney General Robert Kennedy. They were dubbed the Legal Eagles by Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell in 1964. And they authored together and worked together on many anti-poverty efforts, and they co-authored an article in the Yale Law Journal entitled "The War on Poverty, A Civilian Perspective." And it outlined a concept for dealing with poverty as a national problem and to create services for the poor. The article is cited as the genesis, so it was there at the beginning, of formalized legal services, and has become the most cited, among the most cited articles in Yale Law Journal's history. And in the academic world, because I teach at GW, we count these things. They continued throughout to combat social inequities through the launch of the Citizens Advocate Center, which organized the Citizens Board of Inquiry into Hunger and Malnutrition in America. They undertook a 2-year campaign organizing Native American leaders in an effort to end official federal policy of terminating Native American tribes. And with that, the book he authored, Our Brother's Keeper, The Indian in White America, a classic indictment of America's treatment of Native Americans. And that ultimately led to Public Law 93-638, the American Indian Self-Determination Act. Whereas together, Edgar and Jean founded the Antioch School of Law in Washington in 1971, the nation's first public interest law school, and they would serve as co-deans until 1980. And the school's admission policy was hardly conventional, thank heavens. They relied hardly on LSATs or other, conventional predictors of lawyering competence, but instead, all first-year law students were required to live in the homes of client families in the district for the first 6 weeks, and they had to show the kind of passion and commitment that Edgar and Jean themselves showed for ending poverty. Edgar and Jean joined with students, faculty, and alumni of Antioch, along with local and civic leaders and grassroots campaigners, to retain Antioch School of Law's mission, curriculum, clinical programs, and personnel to benefit the city by persuading the Council of the District of Columbia in 1986 to pass legislation that reestablished the school as the District of Columbia School of Law. Here we are. After Jean's death, Edgar joined the faculty of the District of Columbia School of Law as a distinguished professor of law, introducing students of every entering class to the unique mission of this law school and to the idea of law and justice. At the end of the Kahn's tenure with Antioch, Edgar began developing a strategy again to try to empower the poor, a new kind of tax-exempt currency initially called service credits, later dubbed time dollars, and he authored with Jonathan Rao, Time Dollars, a book about how to use this new idea that he had to help address poverty. He worked on many fronts, and I don't want to go on too much at length, but I do hope people will look at this resolution adopted by the council. He leaves behind an incredible legacy of fighting for systemic justice and valuing human worth and human potential above all else. He was a visionary in new strategies alleviating poverty and empowering others, and a pioneer in clinical education. And for my purposes, and on behalf of the council and the district, he was a beloved Ward 3 neighbor, a dear friend, someone who meant so much to so many, but was someone that we claimed as our own. Of course, many of you do. He was a lifelong servant leader with an unwavering focus on helping the most vulnerable. He was equally beloved for his kindness, and he will be greatly missed. Resolved by the Council of the District of Columbia that this resolution may be cited as the Edgar Cahn Legacy Resolution of 2022, because that's when we did it. The Council of the District of Columbia celebrates the extraordinary life of Edgar Stuart Cahn and shares heartfelt condolences to Christine, his children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and the UDC law community in recognition of his outstanding service, again, across many fronts. March 23, 2022 was declared to be, by this resolution, the Edgar Cahn Day in the District of Columbia. And on a personal note, I simply want to say that the man was towering in his morality, in his vision, and his commitment to others. And so he will be greatly missed, but we were all glad to have him in our midst while he was here. Thank you.
Can I read? But give that back to Jonathan. Thank you so much, Mary, for reminding us that this is the first anniversary of the Edgar Cahn Day. So this is a little bit different format. We're going to have some speakers by video. As you know, our dear member of Congress, practically, Jamie Raskin, is immunocompromised right now, but he wouldn't have missed this for the world. So let's have Jamie Raskin, our stalwart member of the January 6th Committee and impeachment manager and rabid advocate for DC statehood.
Hello, greetings to all my friends at the memorial service for Edgar Cahn. It's Congressman Jamie Raskin. I would be there with you in person, but I am immunocompromised right now, and so have been warned away by my doctors from appearing at public events. But that's the only thing that's keeping me from being there with you, and I'm very much with you there in spirit. Edgar Cahn was a hero in my household, my family growing up. My father and my mother adored the Cahns and revered Edgar for all of his remarkable accomplishments and vision. And I'm glad that he will be toasted there today. I know by people in detail about his work in creating the Antioch Law School, which now survives at the DC School of Law, his work with the Legal Services Corporation, his work on behalf of fighting racism and sexism. And he was a man of his times who was way ahead of his times in terms of his thinking, in terms of his moral sensibility. So I wish that we still had him, but it will be a burden upon all of us to try to live up to the legacy that the Khans have created. And we can try to emulate their zealous passion for justice and freedom and equality for all of our people. And thank you for allowing me to say a few words. I know it would mean a lot to my late father and late mother, who loved the Khans so much. Thanks.
Thank you, Jamie. Some of you may have been at Jean's funeral when Jamie and Mark Raskin both played music in her honor at the All Souls Church. It's now my honor to introduce the Honorable Inez Smith Reed, retired from the DC Court of Appeals, former corporation counsel, and so much more. And most importantly, from my perspective, an incredibly hard-charging member of the board of Antioch Law School, DC School of Law, and UDC to this day. Inez?
Thank you, Shelley. Thank you, Jonathan, for reaching out to me through Cynthia Robbins. Thanks to Dean Johnson, Professor Broderick, and this wonderful array of speakers for all you have done to ensure the future of the law school that serves as a living legacy to Edgar and Jean Cahn. Jean was the first Cahn that I met at Yale Law School in 1960. Although my motto at the time was expect the unexpected, I was totally unprepared for the brash, outspoken, self-confident woman who spoke to me in an authoritative tone. I made a mental note to try to avoid her, but of course that was not possible. Then I met Edgar, a calm force, determined, but like me, shy and reticent. Instinct told me that the earnest, soft-spoken, and respectful Edgar Cahn standing before me resonated a power that would draw me into his orbit like a magnet. Eleanor Holmes Norton provided my link to Antioch University by suggesting that I serve as a member of the university's Board of Trustees. At that time, Edgar and Jean had successfully launched the Antioch School of Law, a venture consistent with the university's mission and my personal views. I relished and eagerly supported Jean and Edgar while serving as a trustee of Antioch University and the law school's board of directors. Things proceeded smoothly as the Antioch School of Law turned into an exciting, highly successful venture with its clinical program, its dynamic student body, and its emphasis on making legal services available to the poor. But all too soon, heavy storm clouds hovered over Antioch University and the law school. The university suffered severe leadership and financial crises, and Jean and Edgar decided to sue the university to ensure the financial integrity of the law school. I unsuccessfully begged them not to put the future of the law school in the hands of the courts, strange as it may seem. They believed they had no other choice, and for ethical reasons, I made the painful decision to resign from Antioch Law School Board of Governors in November 1979. Sadly, Jean and Edgar lost their legal challenge, and the university abruptly fired them in 1980. That same year, Edgar had his massive heart attack. I felt as my world had caved in. Jonathan and Reuben, understandably, were profoundly upset and expressed deep anger. Fortunately, a new day soon dawned. In my role as Corporation Counsel for the District of Columbia in the early 80s, I met and worked closely with Council Member Hilda Mason as she and many others laid the groundwork and successfully fought for the creation of the DC School of Law. Jean and Edgar returned to Washington from Miami to once again lead as deans. Happy day. I enthusiastically joined the Board of Governors of the law school after leaving the Corporation Counsel position. I cherish the many fruitful years with Edgar and Jean, and with subsequent deans, including William Robinson and Shelley Broderick. Being part of a community dedicated to justice, equity, the eradication of poverty, and the provision of legal services for the poor enabled me to honor a promise that my twin brother and I made to ourselves as we grew up here in segregated Washington, D.C. I close with one last thought. Sealed in my memory are the precious senior days that Edgar and I spent at various events where I listened closely as he spoke with me earnestly about his creative time dollar value venture and about the urgent continuing need to eradicate unacceptable poverty and to mold talented law students for bold and visionary public service. Edgar was a rare jewel. And now I want to publicly thank Jonathan and Reuben for the awesome love heaped upon their father, a love that undoubtedly helped to extend his life and enabled him to actively resume the visionary mission that he and Jean began. Thank you, Jonathan and Reuben.
Thank you, Inez. I want you to picture Inez and her twin brother and Jean and Edgar and Eleanor Holmes Norton all at Yale Law School at the same time. It must have been something else. Next, we have Baroness Rosalind Higgins, and I'm going to let her explain how it is that a baroness came together with Edgar Cahn. Watch on the screen.
Jonathan, Reuben, Chris, friends of Edgar Cahn. To the fortunate among us, life has some very special blessings. Music, food, family, and friends. And if we've been really lucky, we will have had some special friends whose company we would especially have enjoyed. Edgar was a special friend, but truly a special friend like no other. We didn't go on outings together, still less on holidays. Anyway, I don't think Edgar knew what a holiday was. We didn't treat ourselves at restaurants or go to concerts. This friendship really consisted of just one thing, talking. And if truth be told, it was Edgar who did most of the talking. Our friendship goes back a long way to around 1959, when I went to Yale to pursue a doctorate in international law, having completed 2 prior degrees at the University of Cambridge, England. Edgar was already a standout figure at Yale. We were impressed that among us was the son of a famous and greatly respected father, and that he was already married, and married to the marvelous Joyce Camper Cahn, at a time when interracial marriages were very, very unusual. Before he switched his attentions to the law, he was reading English at Yale and had a very particular interest in Wordsworth. He and Joan together, as you all know, there started their remarkable journey into the worlds of poverty and associated issues, political and legal. I remember with intense pleasure evenings in Yale spent with Edgar and Jean at their home, eating the delicious food that Jean had prepared and talking. The image in my mind's eye of those long years ago was of going to find them through dark, dark streets. I can only suppose they were living in New Haven rather than in Yale. And sometimes my now husband, Terence, was with us, though neither of us today can fathom how that was logistically possible. But I was, and am today, full of astonishment with what they had to tell me. Edgar working for Robert Kennedy and Sergeant Shriver, co-authoring with Jean a major article in the Yale Law Journal, the switch to focusing on Native American rights, and of course, a few years later, the founding in 1971 of the Antioch School of Law and the revolutionary syllabus that it stood for. How could they be doing these astonishing things? Their life seemed full of achievements, punctuated by constant battles and setbacks. This never seemed to get them down. They were always smiling and planning on how to get round the hurdles placed in their way. And of course, in due course, we got to know Jonathan and Reuben, and we stayed in touch after Jean died, with Edgar continuing his life and commitment to the poor and disadvantaged. Edgar, as we all know, began later to focus his attention on time dollars. And this was a work that was never complete. He was able, because there were always new variations, locations, and offspring, to spend a year at Yale where I'd been teaching. And there he could further these ideas and make contacts that he told me later were vital to furthering that work. It gave us the chance to see Ed in London and to feed him at our home. Truth to tell, over the years, Edgar never failed to contact us when he came through London or to The Hague when I was working there. He was a great nurturer of friendships. This busy, busy man was never too busy to dig out his friends, to spend time with them. You can imagine how delighted we were when Edgar told us that he'd found love again and that Chris would be sharing his life. We were so pleased to meet her in London, and it rapidly became apparent that she was a full partner in his work and fully shared his commitment to helping the poor and marginalized. I honestly cannot imagine how any woman would take on as a full partner this special, driven man, but she did. Looking back over the long years I knew Edgar, I think of the early years as the unfolding of endless battles and obstacles, with race and legal radicalism the ever-present backdrop. And I think of the more recent time spent together in this long friendship as a chalking up of more and more successes in time banking, more and more probing with pleasure of what could yet be achieved. I'm privileged that Jonathan and Reuben have invited me to share these memories with you. And I'm so privileged that this extraordinary man was my friend.
I remember when one night I was in the elevator at the DC School of Law, and Edgar, I said, Edgar, you look upset, what's going on? And he said, oh, I have a horrible contractor working on, I can't stand him. And I said, you know, you could have asked my husband, he's a general contractor. He goes, he is? What's his number? And he hired him immediately, and John, Edgar was giving his house to Time Dollars, and he was moving into the basement. And so he wanted a kitchen put in, it was Edgar, so he wanted a nice tile bathroom, but no ceiling tiles. I said, you know, really, Edgar? I don't know. Well, he met Chris, and Chris looked at that basement and said, really, Edgar? I don't know. So they hired John to build out the second floor and another kitchen. Anyway, yeah, Roz was right. A baroness, I loved her. She was great. Next, we're going to hear from Tom Turin, and we're going to let him tell his connection to Edgar. But Tom was the author of Hunger, USA. So let's watch another video.
He's here.
Oh, he's here. Sorry.
He's here. Well, thank you so much. And it's a real honor to be here. When Jonathan called me, I was delighted, largely by the opportunity to come and just see these guys grown up, because the last time I saw them, I think they were just little boys. But they haven't changed much. They're just bigger. The character is the same. Edgar touched a lot of lives. He brought about a lot of change, as we all know. And I'm an example of somebody whose life he changed. I had gone to, I went to Princeton undergraduate, and after my sophomore year, my father, who had been involved in some legislative stuff, had met the Assistant Commissioner of Indian Affairs, somehow arranged for me to do a summer work. I had a summer job at an off-reservation Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding school in Pierce, South Dakota. Now, we know today that those schools were pretty horrific. For me, first of all, I'd never been anywhere where there weren't trees, so that in itself was a big shock. But what really shocked me was the extent of control that the government had over these kids. And I'm a sucker for children. The children I was responsible for on this recreation program were 8 to 12, and they were kept there year-round, simply because somebody in the Bureau of Indian Affairs decided that their homes weren't appropriate. And they were hundreds of miles from their homes. There were Sioux excuse me, and I'm forgetting. And the children were also, there was a concerted effort to take away their native culture. which was particularly disturbing. I got out to the reservations, and there'd be a million acres. A tribe with a few thousand members would own a million acres, but be dirt poor. Well, where I came from in St. Louis, if you had any land, you weren't that poor. So when the summer was over, I decided that I wanted to try to do something. Instead of going to English graduate school, I decided to go to law school because I figured maybe I could make a difference. Well, I went to Washington, George Washington, here in D.C., but after the first semester, it wasn't connecting. I could not see, there wasn't a course that he was teaching. I couldn't see a direct path to my being useful, and I was literally ready to drop out when one day I was walking down corridor in the school, and there's this lecture room, and there's Edgar at the front of the room giving a talk about what he was doing. And for whatever reason, I stopped. I had no idea what he was talking about. I went to the back of the room. And he said he was getting ready to do an expose of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I thought, oh. So I sat down and listened. And then he talked about this project that he was working on currently to end hunger in the United States, particularly among children. And so after the class, I went up and I volunteered to work with him. And took a part-time job with Edgar for the rest of my time in law school. Well, the part-time job was 60 hours a week, as I recall. Well, you don't do less than that with him. It was incredibly intense. I would go to the first class and the exam and cram like crazy in between. Somehow I passed. But everything that I know about being a change agent, I learned from Edgar during that time. And so I consider him very much my mentor. To say friend is really, I had too much respect for him, really, but he was a wonderful friend. But he was a person of incredible intelligence and vision. But more than that, he was a person of tenacity, and he understood how you change things, how you bring about change. And I didn't realize that when I started with him, but that was a lesson that I learned over those 2.5 years that I worked with him. Now, after law school, I went to Maine in the legal services program, which Edgar, of course, had founded. Edgar and Jean had founded, much to his chagrin. He thought that was a big waste. What was I going to do? I went to work for a tribe that consisted of the Indians, who were the poorest people east of the Mississippi, completely forgotten tribe. But learning what I'd learned from him, and I thought I'd be there a year when I first went. I stayed 35. Applying what I had learned from Edgar, I realized that they had a land claim for 2/3 of the state of Maine. And one of the things I'd learned from Edgar is that you don't think small. I remember when I came home and told my wife about the theory that we had for this land claim, she said, well, that's great, but what are you going to do about it? Well, the what are you going to do about it part is what I learned from Edgar. And the first thing we did was to publish a law review article laying out our theories, much the way we did with Hunger USA. Let me go back to Hunger USA for a minute. Edgar put together a campaign that started with sending doctors to the South to document the extent of kwashiorkor. People didn't know that there was hunger in the United States, and that the distended belly that children get who are really sick was a function of hunger. That became the predicate for Hunger USA. And I said, I helped Edgar write that, but I really didn't. I was there, and I did whatever task there was to do. He was an incredible writer. He would sit at the typewriter, and he would produce first copy at 120 words a minute, and it never needed to get edited. I've never seen anybody like that. I certainly can't write that way. But it was also beautifully written and powerfully written. But he didn't stop with Hunger USA. He got that turned into a CBS documentary, Hunger in America, which got to a much wider audience. And that, he didn't stop there. He went from there to an organizing campaign to really build the force. Now, you already had the relationship, I believe, with Bobby Kennedy, but you needed to lay the predicate for Kennedy to do something as dramatic as the food stamp program. And that involved not just documenting, not just articulating, not just disseminating, but also organizing a relentless campaign that resulted in the passage of the food stamp program, which is still here. An astonishing accomplishment that came about not just because of his tenacity, but his brilliance and his foresight and his vision. The same thing with our brother's keeper. My honeymoon was an 11-week research trip camping in the back of my Volvo. My bride stayed with me through it, and it was a phenomenal experience. But after that, as was said earlier, it led to fundamental change. The Indian Self-Determination Act was incredibly important in terms of taking off. I mean, the government for a long time had been working to really get rid of Indian governments, to get rid of anything that was separate and special about tribalness. And the Self-Determination Act was a reversal of that, including ending the termination era, which was a terrible experiment in terminating tribal status. What came out of this with me, I didn't just spend a year in Maine. We brought this land claim for 2/3 of the state. Much to everyone's astonishment, we won a decision from one of the finest federal court judges, Edward Janeau, in the country. We made the bond market collapse in Maine. And it took that, I knew this from Edgar, it took that to get their attention and settle those claims in 1980. It was, I think 300,000 acres got returned. The tribes got recognized as sovereigns, which they were considered legally extinct before. What followed from that was a series of leveraged buyouts in which tribes for the first time took a position like other large players in the economy, acquired the only cement plant in New England. And then beyond that, of course, came gaming with my smallest land claim client, the Pequot tribe. And I had some very smart guys that worked with me. We won the case that forced states to enter into compacts with Indian tribes. It's now a $32 billion a year industry. It's really transformed Indian country. But all of that comes from what I learned from Edgar, which was thoughtful issue picking. You know, in the very beginning, you've got to pick fights that are worth fighting, that can be won. Careful planning and strategy for a campaign, and then the tenacity to see the thing through and bring it home. And that's what Edgar and Jean, both of them, that's what their lives stood for. I'm eternally grateful, not just for those lessons that I learned, but for the time that I got to spend with the two of them. And again, I can't really, I had too much respect for Edgar to say he was just my friend. He was much more than that. He was a real beacon and an example, and that's why we're all here today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. That was fascinating, a chapter I didn't know, and I'm from Maine. Now we're going to hear from Peter McDonald, who was chairman of the Navajo Nation, and this is by video, I believe.
We really appreciate what Dr. Cahn believed in. He believed that if you're going to have somebody, you have to allow that person to help themselves. You have to listen to them and see what they believe is going to help them become self-sufficient. Way back in 1960s, on the Navajo Reservation, it turns out that he Bobby Kennedy and Sergeant Shriver were on the Navajo reservation. I thought they were just want to be on Navajo and see what goes on there. But later I learned that they were hiding from President Johnson. President Johnson wanted Sergeant Shriver to go before Congress and tell Congress that Office of Economic Program, OEO program, anti-poverty program, was not working, so they don't want to fund it anymore. But Shriver, your dad, and Bobby Kennedy didn't want that. They want that program to continue. So the best way was just to hide. And the best place to hide was on Navajo Reservation. So they couldn't find Shriver to testify before the committee, congressional committee, to say the OEO program is not working. That's how they saved anti-poverty program for the poor people. The Bureau of Indian Affairs under Interior Department wanted to administer anti-poverty program or OEO program for the Indians. And of course, your dad and Bobby Kennedy said no. So Sergeant Shriver, Dr. Edgar Cahn, and all the others leaned on the president to allow Native Americans to submit proposal directly to OEO, and OEO would directly fund those tribes, not even to tribal government, but to directly to the tribe. So that's, we set up Office of Navajo Economic Opportunity. And Chairman Reuben Khan appointed me to head up that, to train people how to use their hand, their mind, and their heart in order to accomplish things. We call a community development program. So those were the kind of programs that Dr. Edgar Cahn, with the help of Shriver, fund those programs. And some other tribes realized it. So those tribes also organized and got funds in that fashion. One of the first grants under the OEO program was the Navajo Legal Aid Services, because we didn't have any lawyers, no Navajo law. Now, at the time, at the 1960s, we only have one Navajo lawyer. Their program is independent, and they're on the reservation, and they're helping Navajo people through that program. Today, I would venture to say we probably have about 150 Navajo lawyers or more. Another idea created by Dr. Edgar Cahn was we need to let Congress know. So how do we do that? He wanted more information. So about 4 of us Native American leaders got together with Dr. Cahn at his home. He invited us to his home. He said, "This is your home. Make yourself at home. If you want to sleep here, no problem. Here's a large living room." So he says, "I want all the information I can get about what the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Department of Interior, Department of Labor, and all these different federal government, what have they been doing on your reservation?" He believed that what was the manner in which the federal government is trying to help Native American was not working. And what he was doing was he wanted to write a book that tells the story of all the things that the federal government have been doing for the past 100 years. Yet, Indian tribes are still down at the bottom of the totem pole. That's what he realized. So he wanted to let Congress know, the president know, that what was being done up to that point was not working. So he wrote a book. And from this book came national legislation called Indian Self-Determination and Education Act. It's the masterpiece. It's the government's firm position that Indian self-determination is the goal, is the objective through education and through many other activities, all in that legislation. One man, Dr. Edgar Cahn, made all that change for all Native Americans. It's for America, because now the Indian tribes are now determining on their own what they want, what they believe is going to make them self-sufficient. That was one thing that I really appreciate your father coming to the Navajo, looking at it, talking to the people, really understood. So I truly believe Dr. Cahn was a super social activist. He knew what an individual person, family need in order to become self-sufficient. That was him. To me, there's a lot of saying, you know, one man can do a lot for a lot of people. He demonstrated that. One man, Edgar, with the book, with traveling, education, really showed us, yes, one person can make a big difference. Our brothers keepers. And that's a good title because Dr. Cahn and I became brothers.
Fascinating history, absolutely amazing. Next, we're going to hear from Jim Sandman. Jim was managing partner at Arnold & Porter for some 30 years. He was president of the DC Bar, and it wasn't enough, and he left, and he became general counsel to the Board of Ed, where you have to make your own coffee and everything. He then led the Legal Services Corporation for 10 brilliant years. Now, he is a distinguished lecturer and senior consultant at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and he's going to speak to us now.
I served as president of the Legal Services Corporation for 9 years. Edgar was responsible for the creation of what ultimately became the Legal Services Corporation, the country's largest funder of civil legal aid programs. The Legal Services Corporation funds 132 independent legal aid programs with 900 offices serving every county in every state, the territories, and the District of Columbia. So I had a natural connection to Edgar when I became president of the Legal Services Corporation. Edgar Cahn was as fine a specimen of humanity as I have ever met. He had a deeply ingrained passion for justice and an abhorrence for injustice, and the latter was as important as the former. He embodied the Jewish ideal of tikkun olam, which means repair the world, that each of us has a duty to do something to make the world a better place, and that was infused in everything that he did. Also underlying his passion for justice was a deep faith in the dignity, the value, and the virtue of every human being. He saw the good in people. He was an idealist, a visionary, and a dreamer. But he was also a pragmatist, a builder, and a doer. There aren't a lot of people like that. He had a capacity to take big ideas and turn them into realities that made the world a better place. Edgar was a visionary and a pioneer in legal education. When he co-founded the Antioch School of Law, today the University of the District of Columbia David A. Clark School of Law, he had a vision for a different kind of legal education, clinical legal education, experiential legal education, paired with doing public interest work. He wanted law students to learn in a hands-on way, not just by reading cases in books and discussing them in ivory tower classrooms, but by doing things, and by doing things with a purpose, providing legal assistance to people who couldn't afford a lawyer. He was decades ahead of his time in doing that. Other law schools got the message sometime later. They're still struggling to catch up. There isn't a law school in the country that can hold a candle to UDC David A. Clark School of Law in terms of that combination of experiential learning and serving low-income people. What he did to create the framework for what became the Legal Services Corporation and this network of 132 legal aid programs serving the entire country is amazing. That is a perpetual memorial to the character of Edgar Cahn. And similarly, what he did for legal education at Antioch and now UDC David A. Clark School of Law had a long-term impact on legal education and caused others to rethink how law students should be trained for the profession. This was one remarkable human being. He was a lesson in the difference one person can make, and a lesson also in the importance of bringing passion to your work. He exuded passion, and it was infectious. It motivated and inspired other people. Edgar had one final quality that made him stand out, and it was especially effective when connected to his idealism. He wasn't afraid to make trouble. He wasn't afraid to offend people, to do new and different things, all in the cause of justice. He was like John Lewis in that. He knew how to make trouble, good trouble.
Next, we have Jonathan Smith, a graduate of the Antioch School of Law. He leads the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Urban Affairs. He was formerly our clinic dean. He was at DOJ in civil rights during Ferguson. He led brilliantly the Legal Aid Society, and he was the founder of Prisoners Legal Services. And I taught him evidence. Jonathan?
Thank you, Shelley. That was a kind introduction, and I did learn some evidence. And wasn't exactly the founder. I was one of the first people, though, at Prisoners Legal Services. Well, thank you, Shelley. And, you know, Edgar Cahn was a giant. And it's hard to think about how you remember a giant. It's easy to create a list of all of Edgar's accomplishments. We've heard many of them. He wrote speeches for Robert Kennedy, probably some of Robert Kennedy's best speeches. He and Jean founded the federally funded legal services program that became the Legal Services Corporation. We heard about his work in Indian country. With Jean, they created the Antioch School of Law, which not only trained thousands of activist lawyers, but transformed legal education by pioneering clinical practice. He created youth courts. He founded Time Dollars, a concept that's been used to eliminate poverty and address poverty in communities across the country, and so much more. But that list actually obscures Edgar's true impact. To really understand Edgar's impact, one needs to talk about his effect on people. Edgar cared deeply, deeply about ideas, but Edgar's ideas were simply tools. The object of the exercise was to create justice, equity, and fairness. I was admitted to the Antioch School of Law in 1981. Unfortunately, that was the year after, what should we call it, maybe the unpleasantness with Yellow Springs, and Edgar was not physically on campus. But his presence was felt in every aspect of the school. Edgar insisted that Antioch have a student body unlike any other law school. Students were admitted not solely because of their academic successes, but because of a demonstrated commitment to activism and change. Diversity and demographics were just the starting point. Sitting next to me in class were community organizers, leaders of neighborhood organizations, human rights activists returning from work abroad, people who led rent strikes, people who fought for water rights on Indian reservations, returning citizens. In my class were people who were the first in their family to go to college, who were immigrants, people from elite schools, and those who had to fight hard to get an education. It was wonderful, chaotic, energetic, far from homogeneous, and almost always, I think by design, verging on boiling over. The common thread was Edgar's vision that students be taught that law was a tool to facilitate the exercise of power by people who lived in poverty and oppression. Edgar believed that lawyers did not own that power. They were the vehicle through which it was to be used. When I started at Antioch, we benefited from an orientation program of Edgar's designing. You've heard a little bit about it. New students lived for several weeks with a community activist who'd been a client of the clinics. The school went to great lengths to ensure that this was not poverty tourism, but instead a lesson in the district, the power of community, and the leadership of people who faced oppression and racism. I stayed with a woman and her son in a townhouse at the very edge of the Eckington neighborhood. The mother had lived in the area for decades, and over dinner, she told us about the organizing for the March on Washington. The March office had been just a few blocks away in the Shaw neighborhood, and the whole neighborhood around it had been participated in the effort. This was just the beginning. It was followed by legal education, where nearly half of my credits, and candidly the majority of my time, was spent on delivering legal services to clients. We learned how to be legal services lawyers, technically competent, compassionate, and respectful. We also learned that we were partners with individuals and communities seeking justice. We were not saviors. Every moment, Antioch was infused with Edgar's philosophy that everybody mattered and that everyone had the power to contribute to positive change. When I became the executive director of the Legal Aid Society in District of Columbia, I returned repeatedly to Edgar and Jean's seminal article, The War and Poverty, A Civilian's Perspective. In fact, people in the office would run away when they'd see we'd made it because I'd make them read it. The article famously argued for, and I quote, legal representation as a form of enfranchisement, as an attempt to institutionalize the functions of dissent and criticism, and as a means of revitalizing the democratic process. Put in more plain language, the article argued that keep the power with the people. At core, the article argued that legal aid needed to move past being an exercise in charity to a matter of justice. Edgar and I became personally closer during the year or so that I was part of the clinical program at the law school. He would stop by my office for a, quote, 5-minute chat, end quote. 90 minutes later, he would have woven together a proposal for something that the law school should do, a case we should bring, a new organization to start that fought inequality through principles of $10 and community power straight out of the 1960s. Every idea was brilliant, even if the ambition was overwhelming. Finally, I note Edgar's kindness to me. He was always encouraging, excited by every accomplishment and every victory. And it was not just me. I saw him time and again lift up a student, a staff member, a faculty member, a tenant, an activist. To Edgar, there truly were no throwaway people. When I read Edgar's obituary in the paper, it had a jarring phrase that said he died of heart failure. While the organ in his chest that pumped blood may have stopped, one thing of Edgar's that never failed was his heart. His heart was as big and as true as anyone I've ever known. Edgar, we miss you. However, you are around us everywhere. Your legacy is in this school. It's in every legal services lawyer, in community organizers, and in oppressed people expressing their own power. Thank you.
Fabulous. When Jonathan arrived from Maine at Antioch, sight unseen, he put himself through college and he got on a bus and came to Washington Next, we're going to hear from Ralph Nader. You may have heard of him. Consumer advocate, presidential candidate. I will let Ralph speak for himself.
Of course, I heard of Edgar and Jean over the years, and my memory of when I really met them. It was at an Antioch Law School graduation for one of our colleagues. They were both on the podium directing the proceedings. He was the greatest jurisprudential figure in American law in his time. He went from jurisprudential theory to jurisprudential practice on the ground. And almost nobody in our legal profession can do that. They're either at one level or another. He was a thought leader. He and Jean conceived, launched, and lobbied through Congress legal services for the poor. They started a unique type of law school, Antioch Law School, that's going to graduate people who aren't going to go to work for corporate law firms. They're going to work for the people, and especially the low-income people. He was a great motivator for his students, who number in the thousands. Of course, I was a very strong advocate of legal services for the poor, small claims court, and all the other reforms that he would advance. My approach was the predators on the system who destroyed access to justice, access to the courts, to the regulatory agencies, to the legislature, to the media, and took it over, in effect, and made it the rule of law for the masses, but the law of rule for the few who decided for the many. And so there's a heavy emphasis on the corporate manipulation, control, and diminishment of the legal system in terms of being accessible, affordable to the entire population. Edgar took it from demand for justice not being met by the supply of justice. And that meant that all kinds of demands for justice by people in their various needs, family needs, consumer needs, community needs, environmental needs, were not being met. So there was a rationing of justice, and that's what he focused on, to expand the supply of justice that could be delivered affordably and efficiently to anybody who needs it, regardless of their ethnic, racial, political, class background. Edgar Khan was very sensitive and knowledgeable about the difference between charity and justice. So clinics could provide legal charity for people immediately in need, but the clinics have to strain to deal with prevention and to represent structural preventive changes, which is the difference between charity and justice. Charity shows poor people where they can go for food stamps and how to fill out the forms and how to find the food pantry. Justice means that they have employment, living wage, retirement security, workplace rights, so they don't need food stamps. Most law school clinics are inevitably drawn to emphasize the immediate needs of people, which is charitable justice and not preventive justice. Edgar Khan was very, very aware of all that. That's why he dealt with structural preventive issues. That's why he wanted co-production, where he would see legal services provided for the poor, but then the poor would be given a role in extending it to others and monitoring it and giving their suggestions as to how to make the administration of it better. That co-production was a huge innovation in American legal history, and I thought the most understated book that was written in 50 years was the one that he titled No More Throwaway People. Edgar Khan created a new currency, which was time. Time is inherently an egalitarian currency because no matter whether you're rich, poor, middle class, you don't have more than 24 hours a day. And so immediately the predicate that he established was equality. And then he proceeded to show that a couple that wanted their sidewalk shoveled or their grass cut by a teenager could be received by the teenager in return for tutoring the teenager in terms of a subject that the teenager may need help on at school. Just take a simple example. The teenager danger is getting bartered back in something that's very, very real. But more important than even that was it bound the community together. It bound the neighborhoods together. It bound people together, which provided the foundation for more elaboration of a democratic and just society. And so he developed the theory, but John wrote the book, developed the computer programs, and then started going around the country to implement it. He opened a lot of doors for major reforms, charitable service reforms, structural reforms for thousands of law school graduates and faculty to pursue. As he would have been first to admit, he left a lot of unfinished business, like everybody does in this mortal world. But nobody really opened as many conceptual doors relating to law school education and immediate postgraduate engagement in what Daniel Webster once called the great purpose of life on earth, which is justice. Edgar had a fertile sense of indignation about injustice, cruelty, exploitation, poverty, discrimination, usurpation of people's life's possibilities. But Edgar Cahn, in my exchanges with him and observations of him, never raised his voice. He was like a baritone singer who never lost control of his voice, never shouted, even in his elated moments. He would hardly change the tone of his voice, but he would garnish it with a chuckle or two. I hope Edgar Cahn's family, colleagues, and admirers around the country will consider a living memorial worthy of his enormously productive and righteous life. Thank you.
Excellent. John McKnight is next. He was co-founder with Judy Kresman of the Asset-Based Community Development Institute based in Chicago, author of The Careless Society, Community and Its Counterfeits, which provided a compelling critique of professionalized social services and how they undermine human resilience. Edgar and John were allies in promoting a view of communities that focused on strengths, not weaknesses. John McKnight. I think this is a video.
Well, we're gathered here in celebration of a great, great man, wonderful human being. I've known Edgar since I was young. I'm 91. He left us at 86. And I always thought during those years of Edgar as sort of the pathfinder. I would walk the path with him, but he was the leader in finding new ways more than almost anybody else. I think of myself, therefore, as somebody who's like in the Mondragon co-op in Spain. We made the path by walking it. It was invention. And when I think of Edgar, I think above all, he was an inventor. Where other people couldn't see the way, he could see the path. And I could see that he was a good person to walk alongside. Now, we both had something in common, and that is that we were not very happy with the fact that the United States had become, in our long lifetimes, the U.S. had become a consumer society. And the whole premise of the culture is that if you want to get anything of consequence done, what you've got to do is buy it, not create it. And Edgar and I both, I think, walked together because we both didn't believe that a consumer society was a good society. Now, what Edgar did was he figured out a way to create a tool that you could use that would get you out of the money world, out of the consumer society, and into a society in which what was valuable, what was better than money, was the gifts, capacities, skills of each individual. But those are generally hidden. People don't know about those wonderful possibilities of their gifts. And so what he did was he created a tool that allowed us to have the wealth of community become visible and usable. And he called that tool a time bank. And in the time bank, there weren't dollars, there were capacities, skills, abilities, all of which could be which could be traded without money, and instead their value was in time. Edgar and I, too, had the idea that a market makes people poor, and a community is full of wealth if you have another kind of bank which makes us whole. I worked with others on another approach on the pathway right beside his, called the asset-based approach to community development. But we were going to the same place. And we were going to the place where the value of every person could be recognized, rather than a place like the average bank where they can help you go into debt and other wonderful conditions. So Edgar leaves us with a wonderful, wonderful, new, inventive, insightful way of using our wealth that doesn't come in coinage. He, in a sense, made visible the invisible wealth of communities. And we're forever in his debt for his insights, his enthusiasms, and finally, the fact that he was a good and a kind man. Edgar, we treasure you and everything you taught us, and we'll keep on your path. Thanks.
Lovely. Joe Libertelli is a 1985 graduate of Antioch, and he led the alumni effort Antioch is for Activists campaign and the Save Antioch School of Law campaign. He was elected by the alums to serve on the board and still serves. He was my right arm as dean for 20 years. And he's a green activist and organizer. I give you Joe Libertelli.
So I don't do this kind of thing, so I'm terrified. But as a graduate and as our alumni director for 23 years until last year, I just wanted to start out by saying that this event, with all the folks online, there are over 650 people registered for this event. This is the biggest alumni event ever in our history. And that's thank you to Edgar Cahn. In the months before I graduated in 1985, I helped lead the student effort to stop the ABA from removing Antioch School of Law's accreditation. I and other students traveled to the Washington Lee University campus, met with the ABA, and succeeded in buying more time. And then, a month or two later, we heard that Antioch University's new president, Alan Guskin, was going to ask the board to close us. So again, we mobilized, and students and faculty, including Dean Broderick, then faculty member Broderick, clinical fellow Broderick, I don't know, the lowest paid faculty member in the country, she used to say. We traveled to Yellow Springs, lobbied the board, and once again bought time. But we were not, when we got back to DC, even with the help of Ralph Nader and many other prominent citizens, we were not able to raise the millions of dollars that Antioch University required to keep us open. And so we appealed to then Council Chair David Clark to support our becoming the district's public law school. He agreed, and he turned the matter over to Hilda Mason, who chaired the Council's Committee on Education and Libraries, and Ms. Mason then turned it over to Dennis Desmond, the clerk of her committee, who was one of our graduates, and he wrote the legislation. But it wasn't a matter of just writing the legislation. There was a whole campaign to launch. We did everything we could think of, but in the spring of '86, with 3 weeks before the big vote, we didn't have the votes. We had the majority of the council's support, but not the supermajority we needed in order to overcome what we thought would be a veto by Mayor Marion Barry. We had packed public hearings, we gathered letters of support, we collected 10,000 signatures, we did various creative demonstrations. We got letters published in the Washington Post, but we still didn't have the votes. Meanwhile, throughout the campaign, a debate had quietly raged about whether or not to call the Cahns. As you've heard, the Cahns, after losing their battle for control of the law school in 1980, had been moved, one could say were exiled, to Florida, where among other things they started the time banking movement, then time dollars. We knew that they knew everyone in DC, but we had also heard that while many people loved them, we had also heard that some people, well, let's just say they didn't love them so much. They were controversial. Still, we needed to roll the dice, so I got their phone number from James Nowlin, the school's head custodian, and summoning my courage, I made the call, and Jean answered, and I made my case. She replied, "Well, Edgar and I have been through a lot with Antioch." And I said, "I know, Mrs. Cahn, but that's just what you were fighting for, an independent Antioch-like law school." And again she said, "Well, I don't know, but give me your phone number and I'll talk with Edgar." My heart was pounding and I was in a full sweat. I was sure they would not help us, but I had never met them, and I was wrong. I'm imagining that she might have said to Edgar that night, "Edgar, do you think we can help them?" And Edgar replied, "Yes, we can." Where have we heard that before? The very next day, to our shock, we were shocked to get a call that they would be in D.C. the next day. Now, we hadn't actually invited them to come to D.C. We were hoping they would help with fundraising and political contacts. We never dreamed that they would actually show up. But, they were coming, so we went with it. We called a press conference. When we got their picture in the Washington Post. We had already taken over the dean's suite, but when they showed up, it seemed only right to give it back to them. So they went right back to their old office. And I think it was the next day after the photo appeared in the Washington Post, our work study student who handled the reception work, Kevin Dougherty, got this call from a guy named Justice Lewis Powell. And Kevin was so flustered that he forgot how to transfer the call to the back office. So he ran and got Jean, who was there, and she came out, and in front of gasping and gaping students, she talked with Justice Powell, who she told us, basically had told her, it's really right and fitting that you guys should come back to town to take care of your baby in its hour of need. I will add that in a kind of amusing historical note, that flustered receptionist, Kevin Dougherty, is now himself a justice of the Supreme Court of the state of Pennsylvania. And so Edgar and Jean got to work. We youngsters thought we were cool because we were working 12-hour days, 7 days a week. But boy, were we shamed. They did 16-hour days, and I think they must have added a day to the week. Or I can't. It's been a long time ago. But among other things they did, all the things they did, perhaps the most important one was they got themselves invited to the monthly Baptist Ministers Breakfast Conference. And they made the case for the legislation. But despite all of these frantic efforts, when it came to the roll call vote, we were still one vote short. But then the Cahn lightning truly struck. And this always chokes me up, and I know it's going to again, but that's just life. During the roll call vote, one of our chief antagonists, Ward 7's H.R. Crawford, a former Nixon appointee, an alleged slumlord who I just heard confirmed he used to carry a gun with him when he collected rent, got his turn to speak. And I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said something like, "I've been against this legislation from the very start. It's a bad idea. We can't afford this, we can't manage it, and the last thing the District of Columbia needs is more lawyers. But yesterday at 5 p.m. I got a call from Reverend so-and-so saying, you have to save Antioch. And at 7 p.m. I got a call from Minister so-and-so saying, you have to save Antioch. And at 9 p.m., Reverend so-and-so called, and he said the same thing. And at 8 a.m. this morning, Reverend so-and-so called. So I know how my constituents feel, and I am supporting this legislation." So while there are many links in the chain that created the UDC David A. Clark School of Law, there is no question in my mind that without Edgar and Jean Cahn, we would not have been, as Jonathan put it, resurrected as the UDC David A. Clark School of Law. And so we would not be here in many ways without Edgar Cahn. Thank you.
The incomparable Joe Libertelli. Rabbi, we're going to hear for a musical interlude.
So this needs to be more than just a musical interlude. How about if we imagine ourselves as one of Edgar's tulips or flowers in his garden? Please rise, please stand, stretch, grow. Okay, give a little stretch, a little oi maybe, a little oi. Yeah. A verse from Psalms 101, verse 1, of love and justice I will sing. לדוד מזמור, לדוד מזמור, of love and justice I will sing. To you, O God, I sing praises. Of love and justice I will sing. Clap your hands. To you, O God, I sing praises. Of love and justice I will sing. I will sing. So you can sing together. To you, O God, I sing praises. I will sing. To you, O God, I sing praises. I will sing. I will sing. To you, O God, I sing praises. Justice I will sing. לדוד מזמור. May be seated.
We needed that, didn't we? Next, we're going to hear from Mary Schwartz, Edgar's twin sister.
It's very hard to think about Edgar not being here. After all, we were in the womb together, and for all my life, I have felt his presence as my twin. I am told our parents worried about our cognitive ability because we each were slow in talking. I think we made our own language in our cradles and playpen. There was no need to talk with anyone else. Obviously, Edgar has been talking his own language ever since. We all know that Edgar was a pragmatic visionary who dreamed the impossible dream. but unlike Don Quixote, made the impossible happen. His email address was, quote, yeswecan, AOL.com, long before Obama used the phrase. But I want to mention two other sides of Edgar. He was very good at solving problems with his skilled hands, and he had a striking aesthetic sense. He made simple, gorgeous jewelry and a beautiful design mezuzah, which hangs in our house. He and Chris planted colorful flowers which brightened the neighborhood. And he hammered special hooks for our banister, which still keeps us safe. He even figured out how to change the cartridge in my printer. He was always there when I needed him. One incident. All of us had gathered in Boston for my daughter's wedding. That morning the phone rang, and it was my mother saying she was too sick and in too much pain to come to the wedding. I, of course, immediately called Edgar, the, quote, yes, we can man, end quote, who massaged her literally for the entire day so that she could come to the wedding in the evening. It was the most important massage in our family's history. It had a very happy ending. When Jonathan and Edgar decided to be bar mitzvahed together a few years ago, Edgar's commentary focused on the Hebrew word hineni, which means, I am present, I am here, I am ready. I think that word perfectly describes Edgar's stance in his life.
Happy birthday, Mary. Next we have, I had a surprise birthday party for Edgar many years ago, and Lenore, Mom, came. And I just remember her saying, she was telling me about him when he was younger and how she despaired at one point because he had decided he was just going to make turquoise jewelry and that's what he was going to do with his life, and that just wasn't enough. She was right about that. Now we're going to hear from Joyce Camper, I believe Jean and Edgar's niece.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Jean and Edgar's niece. That's a big one. We are a blessed family. And one of the reasons we're blessed is because of Uncle Edgar. Uncle Edgar will always be Uncle Edgar to his nieces and nephews. I'm Jean's brother's oldest daughter. And I feel like I've been especially blessed because I have known and loved the team of Edgar and Jean, and I have known and loved the team of Edgar and Chris. My story isn't exactly a family story, although it came about because I am Edgar's niece. I think my sister and I both were at the house, and we were talking with Edgar and Chris. This is in early 2000s, and Edgar was talking about youth court. And I was teaching at a very small charter school that unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. The charter school needed students, and the young people, and some of the young people involved, in the court needed to get their education. And so I decided that I should introduce Edgar to the principal of the school. He too is since deceased. So we all met. I set it up and we all met, and Uncle Edgar came, and the three of us sat in the conference room, and Uncle Edgar talked about what the need was. And to my surprise, the principal pushed back. He didn't want troublemakers, a school full of troublemakers and so on and so forth. And we ended in short order. And I watched Uncle Edgar stand up, and I looked at his face, and I cannot describe the righteous indignation that was on his face. He was livid. And I thought about when Chris said, well, you know, Jonathan and Reuben and I, we thought maybe you would say something. And I thought about what story to tell. And I think that's the appropriate story to tell for me. Because I recently glanced at the article, The War on Poverty, that he and Aunt Jean wrote. And I was scanning through it and I was thinking to myself, yeah, the war on poverty from a civilian's perspective. People. Uncle Edgar was about the people, okay, not the higher-ups, the people. It's so fitting that someone said in here, they got the phone number from the head custodian. That's just so on point. And I think my story of Edgar's righteous indignation is definitely the example of a person who is committed to the people, all right? The people who need another chance, the people who need assistance. And so I just wanted to share that one today. Thank you all very much.
Uncle Nicky's daughter. Thank you so much. And now we have Chris Gray, the incomparable. Pardon? What I meant to say is next we're going to have Reuben, who will be followed by Chris Gray. Sorry about that. Actually, we're back to Chris Gray. I'd like to introduce Chris Gray.
Oh my goodness. I'm discovering that when you stand up here, you can see absolutely nothing at all. Wow. So, do you know, all the time that I've been sitting here, down below, I've been wishing I had some prepared notes, but I don't. And I'll tell you for why. It's because for day in and day out for the last 2 or 3 weeks, I've woken up in the morning and thought, what am I going to say about the man that I lived with, who was my love of my life, who was like living with a riptide, honestly. And there's just a million ways to talk about being with Edgar. And none of them felt quite right. They were either too intimate or too serious or too theoretical or too this or too that, because Edgar was so many people. I've said to somebody a bit earlier today that to be with Edgar was to be sort of in the eye of the storm. It was both calm and extremely intense at the same time. I think that we might have somebody by the name of Rita Epps in the audience. If she's here, hello Rita, because I remember Rita very early on in my time with Edgar. Oh, and I shall go back a little bit. Before I get to Rita, I'm going to start at the beginning. How's that? The beginning. I was working on my doctoral thesis at UCLA, and my thesis was on the relationship of the Native American tribes, or the American Indian tribes, or the indigenous peoples, however you would like to say it, and the United States political system over time, and how at the beginning of this nation we laid out a principle of freedom for all, a universalist principle, and how it took 200 years to apply that to the indigenous peoples here. So that was what I was working on, and I was meeting tribal leaders over the country, and I'll tell you, getting an amazing education. And people kept saying, have you met Edgar Cahn? And this was prior to the internet era. And I said, no, and nobody knew where he was. Actually, he was sort of nestled, as they would say, or buried, or tucked away in Washington, D.C., surprise, surprise. But it was hard to find him. I did eventually find him. I called him. I interviewed him because he had written The Indian in White America, Our Brother's Keeper, The Indian in White America. And one call led to another, and then another, and then another. And I would call him at 9 o'clock at night in Los Angeles, which was midnight here in D.C. Night after night, we had a Sleepless in D.C. thing going. And I was kind of worried because I thought this man must never sleep, because our calls went on for weeks. And I fell in love with this man over the phone. It was the most extraordinary experience. It's utterly indescribable to tell you what it was like to have those phone calls with Edgar. I've sort of lost myself for words a little bit. So he invited me over. That was in the fall of 1988. He invited me over in February of 1999 to stay with him for a month and see if we got along. It was then I discovered that actually Edgar lives with a bottle of no-dose by his side at all times. So I came. We got along quite well, so he said, would I stay a second month? And I said, oh, that would be very nice. And in that second month, he asked me to marry him. And I said, yes. I just couldn't have been happier. I was just like, this is going to be the love of my life. He already was. It was an amazing thing. And what I already knew was that I was going to leave my life behind in Los Angeles and join Edgar's world. And just to illustrate that, we got married in February the next year. David Schneier was so wonderful in officiating that marriage. And I had 15 guests, and Edgar had 235. Movers and shakers. And I'll tell you, getting him down to 235 was really hard work. So we got married, and then I went. It was like, Chris, would you do a grant? I'd never written a grant in my life. Well, we'll go off and learn how to write grants, and then come back, and you need to do this federal grant for the youth court. He was just one thing after another. Then I did a website, then I helped him with software manual, then it was just on and on and on and on, jumping into one thing after another. And this is where Rita Epps comes in. Because somebody else mentioned that it was you, Shelley, mentioned that the basement was where Edgar lived, and indeed I went down to the basement with him, and all the rest of the house was non-profit. And Rita was one of the staff people in the non-profit, an amazing community organizer. And one day she said to me, you know, being with Edgar, working with Edgar, is like flying in a plane, and you never quite know when he's going to open the door and push you out. And he was right. She was right. That's how it was. It took me 18 months, I think, about 18 months to learn all the aspects of Edgar's world. He was doing the law school, youth court, co-production, and time banking. So I was running like crazy just to map out all of these things, and then another 18 months to sort of try and keep up. And I have this enduring image of Edgar. We would go downtown rather often, and we'd always take the metro. And Edgar belted down those escalators so fast you would not believe, and I was tearing down after him. And that was sort of how it was, running after Edgar. And it took about 3 years before I sort of got almost up to speed. I never got fully up to speed with him. But I will say this, that from the very, very, very get-go, I was his teammate. We were partners. And I know that Jean and he had been that way in the past, and that when Edgar and I met, he was 63, I was 50. It was the last quarter of his life, but he did not slow down in the slightest little bit. And I want to say just one more thing before I end, which I must do, because Edgar would have directed me to do this. He would have been in horror if I did not. And that is to talk about time banking, just for a moment. Because he and Jean had done the most remarkable thing. What they had done was they had changed the shape of law, the practice of law in this country, and the legal education of this country, so as to bend the arc of history towards social justice. But after Edgar had his heart attack, something happened that fired him up even more. He was told he wasn't going to live for very long, and Edgar went into gear. And he knew that they had to replicate what they had done in the law in economics. They had to affect the way that economics works to bend the arc of history towards social justice. But how to do that? That was the big question. Because law is a kind of singular thing, you know? You think like a lawyer. You get trained to be a lawyer. It's a tribe. It's in many institutions, but a tribe. But economics, the economy, that is the wild, wild west, for good and for ill. So what to do? How to change it? And Edgar did what Edgar does. He went to the very heart of the matter, which is money. Money, and he saw that money drives the economy for both good and ill. You can store it up, and so some people have billions while others have pennies. It has price, so that some people earn thousands in an hour and others a pittance throughout their life. It is fungible, so you can use it for anything, both good and for ill. And Edgar thought, I'm going to create a different kind of money. I'm going to create a money that, in fact, does not have price, cannot be stored up, is not fungible because it's directed towards the building of home, neighborhood, and community to make it more trustworthy, more resilient. And that is what he did. Many people have looked at this little funny money that people exchange for an hour, and thought, what's so great about that? But the thing is this: a currency is not an institution. A currency is a catalyst for building institutions. And very early on, Edgar and I actually struggled a bit with the time banking movement because those on the ground in time banking had worked extraordinarily hard to take this little funny money and sort of push upstream with it to make it work in a number of places. And how they had done that was with a very singular model called neighbor-to-neighbor time banking. But Edgar and I believed very strongly that a currency is, as I said, a catalyst for many kinds of institutions. You could not stick with just one. And taking that stance upset people in the movement very, very, very deeply. We had two annus horribilis, as the Queen would say. It was really, really, really tough. But we got through that. Somehow we got through it. It got mended. And now the time banking movement is actually growing worldwide, so that as I speak to you in this very moment is the 5th annual International Time Banking Day. It's always done on Edgar's birthday from 4 to 6, and so this is right at the same time. There are people from China, Taiwan, Korea, India, Uganda, New Zealand, Australia, Europe, South America, Great Britain, all over the world. I've probably missed out some countries. Ukraine has just opened a time bank. So, and every time bank is building, institution building. There are all these little green shoots around the world. And it's not everywhere they're tiny, but in every place where there is a time bank, it is a transformative process, a transformative experience. And that too is part of Edgar's legacy. And I urge you all to go to timebanks.org, where you will see our new website and our new time banking software. And thank you all, and thank you, Edgar, for being the most wonderful, wonderful companion and love and beautiful person for the time that I knew him, at least, which was 23 years.
I don't think Chris needed notes. Now we're going to have the aforepromised Reuben Khan, who is the younger brother, I'm told.
I am Reuben Khan. I am the younger son of Jean and Edgar Khan. I am also well aware that I am the next to last speaker standing between all of you and refreshments, so I promise to be brief here today. I really had not intended to speak here today. And the reason is that this was, in my mind, a public celebration of Edgar Khan, the great man. And however much I appreciate Edgar Khan, the great man, that is not the father whom I loved, with whom I quarreled, whose loss I am still attempting to come to grips with today. As with all fathers and sons, our relationship was complicated and at times difficult, and it seemed to me that we were here penning hagiography, and there's no room for complication. But this past weekend, as I was talking with Jonathan, talking with Shelley, talking with Chris, I began to worry that the picture we were painting of this great man did a disservice to his vision, that it wasn't what he would have wanted. And I say that because my father and my mother insisted upon, what they insisted upon is that the responsibility to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with whatever God we believe in is on each of us. And our smallness, our flaws, our very humanity do not excuse us from that responsibility. My father would have insisted that we are each called upon to do whatever is within our power to bend the moral arc of the universe towards justice. And so as we come together today to celebrate my father's very large and public achievements, my hope is that if we can remember Edgar Khan as the man he was, we won't say how wonderful he was, I wish I could do what he had done, and shrug our shoulders, that we won't relegate to the great men and women of the age the work of seeking justice and of seeking mercy. My hope is that each of us will instead today answer that calling in whatever small way we as flawed human beings we can. Because I'm quite certain that that is what my father would have wanted. And so that's what I ask of each of you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reuben. Reuben was the federal defender for San Diego and a legend himself. Jonathan, you're up.
I am the elder brother, but I have to say, by far the most accomplished trial lawyer, oral advocate, is the man you just saw before you. He's just extraordinary. I'm probably more the shy one, even though I'm the elder. I want to start by thanking you. This ceremony connects people who are very, very special and would have been so dear to my father. If you are here in person or virtually, or if you come upon this in YouTube, there's a reason. When we sought to extend invitations to people to come to this, to experience this, we went to my father's AOL account. 7,000 individual, personal email addresses popped up. Only 1,000 of them were, returned to sender. There are a lot of you out there. You're part of a family. You're part of our extended family. We know you. We care about you. We thank you. For our families, this had a real meaning. We were in jeopardy from the very first. And so many of you have actually saved us, including the people on the stage. God knows what we would have done without Shelley. And she knows what I mean. Or Roz, who took my parents in and brought them to the London School of Economics so that they could work on this crazy idea called time banking. At that time, it was called service credits. You know, it's true. There's a last line of the credo in which they say, all we have is one another. They don't say that in the abstract. They mean that we are busy as a small band of brothers and sisters saving each other as we try to make progress, as we try to move forward, as we try to seek justice. That's really all we have. So thank you, and I want to say to you, please don't stop writing to AOL.com. We need you. Dad, I believe, was making a comeback that night. I remember him seeing me walk in the room, and he looked up with a kind of conspiratorial grin, like a gambler that just pulled to an inside straight. And he says, Jonathan, could you get me a Coca-Cola and maybe some no-dos? Edgar Cahn did not believe in sleep. Chris had it right. Chris had it right. And I think Ralph Nader had it right. He felt to the very end that he had unfinished business. There was no time to sleep, but he would pass away in the early morning hours. I spent a lifetime as a son conspiring, collaborating, and conjuring with him. So I want to share a few recollections that are really personal, but I think you'll understand them. And finally, I want to talk to you about unfinished business and where we go from here. This is my favorite photo of my parents. Look at them. They're so young. Look at my father. Look at his face. He's quiet. My mother is absolutely determined. Those, by the way, are white gloves that extend up to her elbows. They look so innocent, vulnerable. It is the day of their marriage, March 22nd, 1957. The next day, today, would be my father's birthday, and he would always say, "I married your mother and I aged a year." But, you know, interracial marriage in Maryland was against the law, punishable by up to 10 years imprisonment, invalidation of the marriage, and a fine. So let's not let appearances deceive. These are, you know, the equivalent of young Bonnie and Clyde. The next photo is maybe a decade later. It's very often that when I'm in a negotiation or a discussion with friends in Africa or in the Caribbean or even in the United States, I remember one minister 2 months ago said, "You know, that white lawyer is a real problem for us." And my client will usually pull them aside and say, you understand you've made a big mistake. And I'll have to hand over my cell phone and show them this picture. It's the explanation. But look at how different those two are from that first photo. They're all grown up, poised. She's quite elegant. He's looking, I think, a little bit more mature too. And of course, there's a lot that's happened between the first photo and this photo. The war on poverty, a civilian perspective, legal services, our brother's keeper. Tom Turin told you a lot about that. I mean, this is a photo of two people who have just seen so many things change. And in addition, Reuben and I had happened to them. And that was really a world of trouble in and of itself. So these are now battle-scarred warriors. Every day around the dinner table, a new discussion, new strategy. The challenge, of course, was that they were building something very new. One of the things that they were building was a different type of family. They were trying to merge two great traditions: an African-American tradition of response to injustice and a Jewish tradition of response to injustice. So what do you do with two black Jewish boys who have to be bar mitzvahed? Well, you know, my father dodged that one. And so on my 13th birthday, I didn't get a bar mitzvah. I had to wait until he was almost 80 to do that. This is what he gave me: a slim volume, a translation of Miyamoto Musashi's A Book of Five Rings, Musashi being really Japan's greatest samurai. And so you begin to wonder at 13, if that's the answer, what was the question? That is my father and my younger brother. They're in front of the Supreme Court, and he has just finished his oral argument in United States versus Sanchez Gomez, his second oral argument before the Supreme Court. My father's very proud, very, very proud. So maybe he had it right. What he was trying to do was to raise African American Jewish legal samurai. Hats off to you, Reuben. You really should see this guy in court. He's unbelievable. I think in many ways we raised our parents. They were never the ones who were conservative in their views. They came to us many times for sage advice. And that tradition has been passed along, or had been passed along, to the grandchildren. And this is Aaron teaching his grandfather how to rollerblade. I want you to look at the skeptical look on his face. And this is his granddaughter, Danielle. She's showing him how to use Twitter. Within about 2 weeks, she had him up to about 1,000 followers, and she was really on a roll. But look at my father's eyes. He's such a ham. He loves this. He loves the idea that the New York Times is covering him, an 80-year-old activist, learning Twitter. Look in her eyes. You may see some faint resemblance of some other people that you had just glanced. And we were busy also expanding the family. It was always expanding. It was like a circle that just rippled wider and wider. And after my mother passed away, we welcomed Chris into the family. And if you look at that, you'll see my wife, my younger brother, Chris's son, Crispin, and Marna, my brother's wife. But, you know, that circle wasn't closed. Suddenly, you know, we'd spent some years in Kazakhstan, which is another story. Anna appeared, and there was her grandfather and Chris welcoming him there at the airport. And in no time at all, Anna was at 639 North Carey Street with the Campers. And there's her great-grandmother, Florine Camper. I think Dad's done a pretty good job of fusing together a family. One of my favorite pictures, because I think Tom said it really well. He had a capacity to mesmerize, to conjure, but behind it, there was an awful lot of fancy footwork. And this last photo was 2 days prior to his passing. In the last year of his life, I stopped all of my international travel and spent time with him. I spent time with him because we both knew that we didn't know how much more time we had. And I was looking at the email traffic this morning. You know, the family was fully deployed in undertaking at least 3 or 4 major projects that he felt had to be completed. So this is the unfinished business. And it's profound business. And I'll give you a sense of some of that. One of the things that was deeply troubling to my father was that, yes, as Chris says, he would never have forgiven her for not mentioning time banking. But as we thought about time banking, was there a reason? Was there a structural reason? Was there a technical reason that it hadn't gone to full scale? It hadn't transformed everything. And sometimes those are questions of time, but we went on an exploration. Danny started ghostwriting pieces for him. I started connecting him with some of the technologists. And there's a puzzle. There's a puzzle that we are trying to unwrap. The second thing that he wanted to achieve was a third edition of No More Throwaway People. He wanted to write a whole new book, and we made it about halfway through that. He wanted to integrate a story, an example, for each of the ways in which time banking had helped. And he had diligently worked, and Chris had diligently edited his many vignettes. And the third thing that we focused on became known between the two of us as the Cahn Center for Law and Justice Innovation. And there we made it pretty far down the line in terms of developing a blueprint. It really envisioned the transformation of the legal profession, and it sought to address questions of systemic injustice with a fundamentally new conception that he would call ecological jurisprudence. And we made our way through, I think, a pretty complete version of that thinking. This is how he felt 2 days before he passed away. And I think he understood that V for victory was his definition of victory, which is, had he set in motion those things that were necessary to happen to bring to fruition what he hoped would be a better, fairer, more just world. And by the way, on the day he passed away, I have a great video of him in which he is actually on a treadmill, working aggressively. And I don't mean just a foot treadmill, I mean also the hand treadmill. He was certain that he would be able to rebuild. So that leaves us with the last question, that is, what do we do from here? Well, first of all, you're all here. You're the people he would have entrusted his unfinished business to. You're members of the family, the tribe, the co-conspirators, the architects. And so, when we announced this event, we originally said we're going to have three things. And of course, leave it to our family. We were quite ambitious, and we wanted to have not just this memorial celebration. We wanted to have a roundtable on access to justice. We wanted to have a teach-in on systems change. And so I think where we are now is that I'm extending to you, on behalf of the collective family of which you're members, an invitation to those next events, from which we can begin to stage and respond, and hopefully begin the process of completing the unfinished business. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And now we're going to hear, led by Song Rise, a DC-based women's social justice a cappella group. Thank you, guys. Take it away.
said I know that a change is gonna come. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on talking, keep on walking, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Gonna let nobody turn me round. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let inequity turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Gonna let inequity turn me round. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let injustice turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let injustice turn me round. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land. Well, I marched through the storm, and I marched through the rain, and I marched through some sickness and some heartache and pain. And I laid on the ground, and I looked up at the sky, and I prayed to the Lord above and asked why. But oh no, I'm not tired, oh, I'm not through marching yet. Oh, I'm a marching till I die, children, this you can bet. So we say, I'm gonna sing out, I'm gonna march on. Everybody say it. I'm gonna sing out, march on. I'm gonna march on. Put one foot in front of the other. I'll be damned if my children have to march for me. Now I believe in the power of making some noise, and I believe in the power of raising my voice. Now if I die, I can't sing. If I can't sing, I'll die. So we should sing for one another. Now let's give it a try. So we say, I'm gonna sing.
I personally want to thank you for coming out on really a relatively short notice. Songrise, everyone. We've been in touch with Nikki. Is Nikki here? This is Nikki. Okay, a face. Usually it's online. And Melissa, where's Melissa? Melissa, can you introduce us the rest of the members of the group that came out? And there are some 20 women in this incredible choral group.
Yes, happy to. Hi, everyone. I'm Nikki. This is Mackenzie, Melissa, Rashida. Let me go back on this side. Catalina, Amani, Savannah. I want to say another name. I'm so sorry. And Savannah. And we have, we just brought in several new members, and we now have 20, so we're excited to be here with you tonight. Thank you.
And this is their gift to us. This is their gift to us. I'd like to take just one verse, given the hour, just one verse from Marge Piercy's poem, Kaddish. The Hebrew, some of you know, it's a prayer of praise for life. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah. Blessed is the earth from which we grow. Blessed the life we are lent. Blessed the ones who teach us. Blessed the ones we teach. Blessed is the word that cannot say the glory that shines through us and remains to shine, flowing past distant suns on the way to forever. Let us say, Amen. Blessed is the light, blessed is the darkness, but blessed above all else is peace, which bears the fruit of knowledge. On strong branches, let's say, Amen.
Thank you so much, David. And thank you. You guys are fabulous. I can't wait to get you back here. We'll think of reasons. It won't be hard. We have a lot of unfinished business. Now we're going to close it out with This I Believe by Jean and Edgar Cahn, led by Danielle and Anna. And then we're going to continue the conversation at a reception just outside. We've got a deal.
Hello. This I believe. I believe the day will come when rich and poor will stand equal before the law. And I believe the day will come when black and white, Hispanic and Anglo, young and old, man and woman will stand equal before the law. This I believe.
And I believe the day will come when the monopoly over law and legal knowledge, the lawyer's monopoly, the law school's monopoly will be broken. When men and women, and yes, even children, will know that which is expected of them and that which they can expect of others, to refrain from harm, to honor their word, to respect the dreams of others and the right of others, to dream in their own way. This I believe.
And I believe that the day will come when courts of law will be courts of justice, courts for people, not courts for lawyers. Above all, courts to render simple justice to see, that promises are honored, that the injured are made whole, that the weak are protected from the powerful and the greedy. This I believe. Oh.
For in the fullness of time, I must believe that the voices of love shall prevail over the voices of hate, and the forces of justice shall triumph over the forces of injustice and inhumanity. This I believe.
But in the here and now, there can be no safety, no guarantees, and no easy way. At each point, our faith will be tested, and when weighed in the balance, if we are honest, our best efforts will be found wanting. This is true. This I believe.
And so, all that we have in here and now is our love for each other, our willingness to forgive each other, our willingness to come to each other's rescue, and our unwillingness to stand by silent or passive in the face of injustice.
This is my belief. This is our joint belief. And this we shall try to honor, so long as life and breath permit.
What a fitting way to end. Edgar read that at graduation from this stage every single year. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out to celebrate the fabulous Edgar Cahn. Please join us for a reception outside.